walking a little difficult. He just walked the 3 peaks for a very good goal. So if you need a hand.
So, good morning, everyone.
Hey.
Thank you very much.
Good morning. Good luck.
So, yeah, as Ronald said, I'm going to start the presentation with 2 things, an explanation and a thoroughly frustrating statement. So first off, my explanation for me being less mobile than I should be. I just hiked the 3 highest peaks in the UK for charity. It was Ben Nevis in Scotland, Scafell Pike in England, and Snowdon in Wales in 24 hours without any sleep. So yeah, I'm not feeling great. I'm actually only 23. I know I look a little bit older than that. So yeah, you have to excuse me if I cramp up. But anyway, let's go to the rather frustrating statement. So, behind every breach headline are known flaws. Now, I've been in the industry for 20 plus years. I'm sure a lot of you have also been here for a long time as well. And way back when I was actually 23 or 25, I used to break into stuff legally. And I used to target vulnerabilities. At the time, it was things like the IIS vulnerability, the double encoded, double backslash thing. And you'd find these flaws everywhere, and it's brilliant. You could leverage them. You could drop a reverse shell on there and connect to the box, get privilege, and do some really fun things. In reality, things have not changed that much in the last 20 years. And I'm going to give you a few examples of this and talk about what to do about it. So, first off, there's a huge attack in the States in 2021, summer of 2021. The initial attack vector for the Colonial Pipeline attack was actually a VPN concentrator that was misconfigured. Now, this single flaw led to the whole of the East Coast struggling to get gasoline in their cars. People were panic buying. Americans love a panic buy. People were panic buying. Cars were sitting there waiting to get into the service stations, and there was a lot of concern with this attack. A single flaw. Now, rather concerningly, to me, this was really a preview of what modern warfare will become. The targets in the future will be virtual rather than physical. And the weapons used will be known flaws rather than guns and rockets. Wars will be fought and won without a single bullet fired or rocket launched. Now, 20 years ago, when I first started in cybersecurity, before it was even called cybersecurity, we were more worried about fluffy bunny, like graffitiing on people's websites. Now, this is a massive issue that can cause population-impacting events from occurring. So, another vulnerability. JBS, the largest meat producer in the world, Brazilian company, around about the same time as Colonial, they were brought down as well. RDP, Remote Desktop Protocol, or as a lot of us call it, Ransomware Delivery Protocol, because it's used so often for that, brought down JBS. Again, shops were, the shops were left empty. Americans panic buying again. They love their meat as well as a panic buy. Just because RDP was exposed to the internet. RDP should not be exposed to the internet, by the way. That's your top tip, number 1. Now, with JBS, They paid $11 million ransomware. In reality, that was a drop in the ocean to the actual cost to their organization. They had basically all of their staff in Australia, one of the biggest beef manufacturers, I don't know what the word is, growers. They had to stand down for 2 weeks whilst they figured this out. JBS was sent back to the digital stone age because of a single flaw on their external attack surface. Ronald mentioned this one earlier. LastPass. LastPass, great company. I've been an advocate of using password managers for many years. I have like 250 random passwords. I'm not Rain Man. I use a password manager to remember these things for me. LastPass, unfortunately, they got breached. And as Ronald mentioned, it was through a 3-year-old vulnerability. Now, what's really interesting, though, is the actual attack path that leveraged that vulnerability. So the vulnerability was on Plex, which is a multimedia server, hence the delightful picture of a lounge. It's not my lounge, by the way. A delightful picture of a lounge. Plex serves video files, right? You can watch movies from the Plex server. Now, the way that the attackers got into LastPass was through a DevOps engineer's home network. So he had Plex running, hadn't patched it, and they leveraged that as the initial foothold, got onto his network, laterally moved onto his computer, gained privileged, got onto the cloud infrastructure of LastPass, and then they stole the data. It's pretty crazy, right? The fact that he hadn't patched a server that was giving him video files to watch at home that led to LastPass having a very, very embarrassing breach. By the way, that LastPass, the Plex vulnerability, we found that. Tenable found that 3 years ago. We disclosed it 3 years ago. Another one. This is less about the population impacting or embarrassing breach and more about actually cleaning up when vulnerabilities are disclosed. So Log4j, that was a massive problem. Right? Virtually everybody was vulnerable to Log4j. Okay? When Log4j was announced back in December of 2019, no, that's way too early. Hang on, 2021. That was a, we realized that this Log4 little third-party library was literally everywhere. Tenable, we actually created a whole new way of identifying vulnerable systems within the infrastructure. I won't go into too much technical detail, but basically what we would do is we would fire the JD&I request into your applications, and then we'd see if it did a lookup against a fake server that we put up onto the internet, a DNS server. And if it did, it meant you were vulnerable somewhere within the stack. Because one of the biggest problems with Log4j was that it could be like an Elastic search, an elk stack all the way down here, that was getting the code from a web application all the way up here. Right? So you could be very vulnerable to it, but on the surface you might not be. By the way, we were getting 5 million requests an hour against that DNS server. Now that's 5 million vulnerable systems an hour that we were detecting. It's crazy numbers. Now, to clean up Log4j, though, it was incredibly hard. One federal agency in the US burnt 33,000 hours finding and fixing this thing. Incredibly painful. Now, we're actually seeing Log4j still still very prevalent, which is quite often what we see when a vulnerability is disclosed, but we're actually seeing it being reintroduced into people's applications. Basically, DevOps engineers, DevOps engineers, bit dehydrated for some reason, DevOps engineers deploying code, doing pulls from vulnerable GitHub stacks, and actually bringing Log4j back into their applications. So, now I'm going to use lyrics in some of my slides. You might not recognize all of them, but these are some of my learnings to take from. And you'll know they're my learnings because I've basically nicked someone else's genius. Now, this is Jay-Z, if you've never seen Jay-Z. He is a part-time rap star, part-time cyber defender. You've got 99 flaws, but all they need is one. Right? The problem that we face today is the fact there are so many vulnerabilities out there that could be leveraged by attackers. Like Ronald said it himself, 25,000 vulnerabilities disclosed last year, and then over 50% of them are critical or high in nature. Now, the reality is attackers are lazy. They actually only use a very small handful of these vulnerabilities. So, lesson number one, don't patch everything. You can't patch everything. Federal agency took 33,000 hours to fix Log4j. Trying to fix everything is a fool's errand. We call it the hamster wheel of pain. Basically, you find 10,000 vulnerabilities, you go patch all the vulnerabilities, you do a scan, you've got 15,000 vulnerabilities. You have to take a risk-based approach to fixing the vulnerabilities that matter, not the vulnerabilities that are high or critical as defined by the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. So our analysis with machine learning and AI and all these other buzzwords I'm supposed to use, but I refuse to, all of our analysis that we do automatically on these vulnerabilities is that less than 3% of those vulnerabilities disclosed will ever be used by an attacker. In fact, last year, only 2.7% of those vulnerabilities had ever been exploited. 2.7% of those vulnerabilities is a lot easier to fix than 57% of vulnerabilities. So taking a risk-based approach, focusing on the things that matter, differentiating the risky from the risk-free, will make it a hell of a lot easier for all of you to do your jobs. So let's talk about some of the top vulnerabilities last year. Well, you'll recognize some of them: Log4 shell, following Confluence again, proxy shell, like very well-known vulnerabilities. But the top vulnerabilities that were exploited last year were vulnerabilities that weren't disclosed last year. MS-1710 was exploited still today. Ronald was talking about it. Some of the ones that he didn't mention: CVE 2017-0199. That's a Microsoft OLE vulnerability. Still used today. 2017, popped all the time because it works and because people don't patch it. CVE 2017-11882 was another Microsoft vulnerability. Incredibly popular and leveraged all the time, Microsoft Office vulnerability. Again, because it works and it's everywhere. People get the little pop-up that says, Microsoft Update has found an update. What do you want to do? I'm going to click cancel as per usual. Thank you very much for annoying me. Those vulnerabilities are being leveraged time and time and time again by ransomware authors. Now, you look at these vulnerabilities up here, They're actually basically server-side, server vulnerabilities. But in reality, the target nowadays are the click-happy users rather than the protected servers. Like one of my CISO mates, he said to me, phishing exercises are really annoying. I send a phishing exercise out to 10 people, 15 people click it. And it's very true. People fall for this stuff all the time. And it's really annoying that we actually depend on staff to differentiate the real from the fake. Like, you don't blame the chickens when the fox gets in the hen house, right? You blame the farmer. That's you, by the way, right? We need to protect the users from getting these things, protect the users from if they click on it, it doesn't do anything. And to do that, we need to target the vulnerabilities that the attackers are targeting themselves. Like those two vulnerabilities that I mentioned earlier, 2017-0199, 2017-11882, those two vulnerabilities alone, you can actually get rid of a lot of the ransomware that's hitting people. So, ransomware, yeah, big deal. Ransomware, like 30% of breach events in 2020 were ransomware. I can't remember where I stole that statistic from. But like in reality, it's a lot higher, right? Ransomware is simply the monetization of poor cyber hygiene. And it is really lucrative. It's think back 50 years ago, people were walking into banks with guns and stealing money, right? No one does that anymore. Why bother? Like the easiest way for criminals to get money nowadays is by targeting people that will click on anything that's ever sent to them. It works time and time and time again, and it will continue to work until we fix the flaws that they target and we stop paying them. There's a big thing at the moment, I'm sure you're all aware of it, Clop have, and I'm going to talk about it in a few minutes, Clop have popped some of the biggest infrastructures in the world. Now, that attack, like, they're going to make millions and millions and millions off that because people will still pay it. As I said, JBS, they paid $11 million. Billions of dollars are going to these attackers because people aren't patching. So, I told you I'd talk about Clop, didn't I? This is a young gentleman that came up with the song I Like to Move It, popularized by Madagascar. For those of you that have children, I have 3 children. For those of you that have children, you've probably heard it many, many times before. Clop are an attack group that have been leveraging file transfer vulnerabilities. Excellion, before it, there's Go Anywhere one, I can't remember what it was called. But just recently, actually in the last couple of weeks, they've been using the Move It vulnerability on the file transfer server. Now, they've popped some of the biggest infrastructures and managed to get lots of data. The way they've actually done it is through third parties, like British Airways, as an example. They were popped through like a payroll server, a payroll service. But they are now holding all of this data back from being published until they get paid, or if they don't get paid, they'll just release it all. Like I think there's about 11 or 15 companies that have currently said that they've been popped. It's going to be a hell of a lot more. Now, this vulnerability is actually really interesting. I could go into it for a little while, but this vulnerability, the attacks against it were first started to be seen about a year or 2 ago. But nothing was actually disclosed on it until a few weeks ago. Now, back to my original statement at the start, not the one about the mountain, the one about behind every breach headline. It's a 0 day, right? Gavin, you don't know what you're on about. 0 days used all the time, right? In reality, 0 days can sometimes be used as the initial attack vector, but then after that, another attack vector will be used for a known flaw. Okay? So within these, they would have used something to get lateral movement within the infrastructure. They got privilege escalation, they would have used lateral movement, which I'll talk about in a second. So, then of course we have the cloud. This is Snoop Dogg, sometimes rapper, often marijuana smoker, and firewall admin. Misconfigs and vulns together, now you know you're in trouble, ain't nothing but a cloud thing. One of the biggest problems we have now is that these vulnerabilities are being deployed on infrastructures that are spinning up in seconds rather than weeks or months. Like back 20-odd years ago, part of my deployment strategy was the Phillips screwdriver. You kind of like rack mount a server, screw it in, put the Ethernet cable into the back, spin it up. Okay? Like to deploy a server, it took 4 hours to install the software, and then it took a little bit of effort. I feel like a lot of effort today, to be honest, like putting a rack server in and booting it up. Nowadays, I can deploy software in seconds. I write infrastructure as code. I spin up Kubernetes, a cluster, or a pod, and then boom, I've got a cloud infrastructure. I can deploy really fast, but unfortunately, what gets deployed is often vulnerable and misconfigured. DevOps are all about speed, all about getting stuff out there quick, fixing things quick, getting it done. But the problem is they're also introducing risks time and time again. I mentioned Log4j earlier, and as I said, we're starting to see it come back again. And the reason for that is that the DevOps are pulling vulnerable versions. Like Heartbleed, that was a massive vulnerability in SSL. CV 2012-0160, I think it was off the top of my head. Big vulnerability, right? We saw that for years after. The tail, the long tail of that vulnerability was huge because they were pulling the SSL libraries for many years, and it was actually within container images that were being leveraged as well. Huge problem. What worked at 60 miles an hour won't work at 200 miles an hour. I always joke that if I took my mum out of her, whatever car it is, and popped her into a Ferrari, bad things would happen, right? And this is the same thing with organizations that are going through digital transformation. They move to the cloud, but they've got an old way of looking at deployment. They've got an old way of looking at managing these misconfigurations and vulnerabilities, and it introduces a huge amount of risk. The other problem they have is the fact that they're increasing your external attack surface to the point where nobody knows what they have exposed to the internet. Like we bought an external attack surface management company earlier last year. And we went back to our clients and we said, look, use this. Use it for free. Just go scan your infrastructures and find the things that you're not testing for vulnerabilities with our technology. And it was unbelievable the amount of stuff that these guys didn't know that they had deployed. This is Joan Osborne, one-hit wonder, now a CrowdStrike engineer. What if Ops was one of us? Okay? One of the things that, what if God was one of us, for those of you that aren't aware of the original lyric, what if Ops was one of us, right? I can remember a few years ago, I went over to work with some DevOps guys on their security. Obviously it was in LA, because, they're all cool and things like that. It was quite cool. I ran Santa Monica and taught DevOps. Can't think of a better way to spend a week. And what was really amazing was they had no consideration for security at all. Like they were pulling containers, downloading them, like building their stack on it. Oh, okay, yeah, we need Apache, we need this, we need this. They were like building it into their infrastructure as code, push, boom, now 1,000 servers are running. And I said to one of them, can I have a look at that container that you're using as your base image? I found like 40 vulnerabilities on it that were really, really critical. And they would have just like rinse and repeat, push that out like thousands of times without even thinking about it. So one of the great ways of securing the cloud is actually by looking at the code before it's even deployed. As I've mentioned a couple of times, infrastructure as code is like the recipe for what the cloud is going to look like. Analyze that for misconfiguration and vulnerability before it's ever deployed. And then any flaws that you find within it, merge it into their code so the next time it's fixed. Okay, let's talk about how they actually break into stuff. So, as I said, I used to break into stuff, mostly legally, and always illegally, sorry, I'm a bit tired. And this was the kind of attack path I used. This is the thing that I learned when I went through hacking school. Really easy for them to do, right? This standard attack path. I'm using alliteration rather than the correct words. But right, first off, they enter. Now, as Ronald said, phishing is very often that initial point of entry, okay? What he didn't mention was that often what the attacks are actually doing is they're targeting a flaw that's known that they can exploit, right? So, like, as I said, you know, those Microsoft vulnerabilities, you know, the Google one, CVE 2022-0609, is a really popular attack vector because it's a browser vulnerability, not zero click, but one click. So basically, you can use it for malvertising. Go to your Google browser, bring up a web page, click on something, boom, you've got that. You know, the attacker's got their initial foothold. Okay. But they get it. Credential stuffing is a big problem nowadays. You know, you see these huge databases of credentials that have been exposed to the internet. Often people use the same password. We know this. I know this because when I was getting married, I had to do a personal risk profile and included the fact my wife's passwords are shit. So, you know, people do use bad passwords. Okay? So credentials are, or a flaw on the external attack surface. Very often a flaw on the external attack surface. The statistics are like, you know, 10% of all attacks are through a vulnerability on the external attack surface. In reality, it's loads higher. But nowadays, your external attack surface is actually your endpoints as well, right? Because they're all connected to the internet. Not connected back, but they're all connected to the internet. The dirty internet, all your users are using their vulnerable versions of their browsers and their email clients and things like that. The external attack surface is now on the inside as well. Once they are in, they then explore. They have a look around. What is on this network that I've just handily landed upon? And often they map internal infrastructures better than the actual employees do. Can anyone remember the Karabanek attacks back in 2017? Karabanek, I think they were called. It was a few Eastern European banks. Right, if you've never read into this, it's actually worth spending some time to go and read up on it. Karabanek, can't remember how to spell it, but it probably would have been bigger news if they'd actually used a word that you could remember. And you know, once the attackers had got in, what they actually did is they mapped out the infrastructure and they installed little remote view software on all of the endpoints. So you could see how bank tellers were transferring money between different departments and different companies through like the SWIFT system. And what they did is then they broke in and they did exactly the same thing. Like part of that attack path, they actually had to knock the printers offline because one of the things that they saw is like every time a transfer was done, a print, there's another print. Okay, there's like $5 million to here. So they had to knock that offline so no one saw the fact they were stealing all this money. Between $300 and $900 million, by the way. Now, the reason for the $600 million variance, which is quite a lot of money, because the banks wouldn't disclose how much they lost on that particular one because they were quite embarrassed. There's actually a brilliant video where they actually did some physical attacks as well, and they installed software on the ATMs as well. There's a brilliant video. A guy walks up. He's got like a hoodie jacket on. He kind of walks up, opens his bag, puts a special number in, doesn't even put a card and puts a special number in, and then it just spits all the money out. It just keeps on spitting out. It's like a 2-minute video, and he then just walks off. And he obviously goes and does it to another one. Like, they lost like $50 million in actual cash through that attack. So once they've explored, they find the things that they're interested in. What are they interested in? Active Directory. Active Directory is 20 plus years old, and people don't even think about it as part of their attack surface. But an attacker is the most important thing within that infrastructure because they need privilege. And the best way to get privilege is through your misconfigured Active Directory server. And as soon as they find that, they then leverage golden ticket attacks, Mimikatz, all these different ways of getting privilege, and then you're screwed. Pause for effect or a drink. As soon as they have privilege, they can then evade. They can remove all of their footprints leading up to this event. Detection and response is really hard, and incident response is really hard when you don't know what you're looking for because they've dropped the logs. More importantly, when they have privilege, though, is that they can live off the land. They can use all of your tools against you. PowerShell, as an example, is a really useful tool for deploying enterprise software and configuring systems across a very large piece of infrastructure, for good or for bad. And if I've got privilege, I'm going to use PowerShell to push my code out incredibly quickly. And so when you see ransomware attacks, they're like enterprise-level ransomware attacks. They're not leveraging the same vulnerability on each of the endpoints. What they're doing is they're leveraging one vulnerability to get in, another vulnerability to gain privilege, and then they're using the tools that you have within your infrastructure to encrypt all of your endpoints. So, super important that you fix the flaws that they're going to leverage to get in that initial foothold, and then fix the flaws that they're going to use to elevate. Active Directory is always misconfigured. Like when we bought a Active Directory company called Ulsid, and I was part of the acquisition team, and when we were going through all of their reports, one of the most interesting part was they would do a check whenever they were working with a new client. They would do a check, and like 9 out of 10 of their customers were extremely vulnerable to domain-level attacks. Like literally every time they walked into a company and engaged with them, they did a check, and that, like pretty much everyone was vulnerable. Active Directory is the forgotten grandfather of people's infrastructures. And then, as I say, they exfiltrate. Steal data, or more likely, demand money. As I said, ransomware is just the monetization of poor cyber hygiene. Now, you can break these paths that they take. You can make it difficult for attackers to break in if you concentrate on these points where you make it difficult for them. Best way to do that, take the vulnerabilities away that they're going to leverage. Don't worry about the vulnerabilities that have got headlines. Don't worry about the vulnerabilities that CVSS tell you are the most critical vulnerabilities. Leverage the ones that you know are going to be exploited by attackers. Now, Roland was talking about the fact that it's going to be a seamless world. And I find that really, I do agree with him, by the way. I find that a really interesting statement. Because to me, one of the other things that we need to think about is how do we move from response to prevention? Now, response can be endpoint, obviously, like EDR, XDR, ZDR, MDR, all these different things. How can we move from those things picking up a breach whilst it's happening to stopping it in the first place? And this has been my thinking for quite a few years, hence the annoying statement behind every breach headline. It's like, how do we move to this more preemptive, proactive approach to securing infrastructures? And frustratingly, it is just by fixing the few things that attackers are going to target. Because if the flaws aren't there, they can't get in. So, I made a mistake about 6 months ago. I like Sonos, the multi-room audio system. I've got a lot of them around my house. And my 7-year-old came up to me, Daddy, can I play music on your speakers? I was like, oh, okay, darling. And I installed Sonos on her phone. All I've heard for the last 6 months, in like literally every room of my house, is Taylor Swift. Okay? Don't do that. That's another piece of advice for you. Don't give your 7-year-old child access to your music system. She's too cute. I would have given it to her. But in one of her songs, Taylor Swift, part-time songwriter, now a checkpoint engineer, her Band-Aids don't fix bullet holes. And this is incredibly true when it comes to cybersecurity. Deploying EDR is not going to make you more secure if you don't fix the things that they're going to use to get in the first place. Fix the flaws first. Like one of my really good mates, he was the CISO of Visa, a guy called Matt Johnson. Really weird. He was an ex-drinking, well, not ex-drinking, he was a drinking buddy who became the CISO of Visa. And so we used to spend a lot of time together, good chap. And him and I were in San Francisco at RSA, a good few years ago this was. And we're having a couple of beers at the Westin. If you've ever done RSA, who here has ever been to RSA? Yeah, sorry for you, yeah. At RSA, there's a bar just opposite the Moscone Center called the Westin. It's really expensive, so only vendors drink in there, basically. I was in there with Matt, buying him a couple of beers, and behind him, he could see like people high-fiving and stuff like that. Hey, man! Like high fives, happens a lot in American bars. And like people like celebrating, things like that. And he noticed that all of them had like the lanyards around their neck. And he said something quite profound to me, a little bit of sketchy memory because we're about 5 beers in. But he said, I wonder how many people are celebrating the fact they've sold something to people where the problems don't even exist. And I was like, oh, what do you mean by that, Matt? And he said, the amount of bullshit that's peddled to me as a CISO to try and fix problems that I don't even have, like people have invented problems and a solution to fix them, happens all the time. So one of the things that he did to stop this from happening, because it was happening a lot, Visa are a big company, right? You can imagine the CISO of Visa, he was getting pitched constantly. And if anyone ever came to him in his group, his like security team, and they said, "Hey, Matt, we've got this great new technology. It's really cool. It's got a great logo," he would say to them, "Okay, before you can buy anything, show me an accurate asset list of all the assets within your infrastructure that you're securing, all the vulnerabilities that you've discovered and addressed, and then a couple of misconfigurations, a couple of other things like foundational controls." And if they didn't have the answers to those, then he wouldn't let them spend any money. Because he knows that fixing those foundational security controls first means that he's going to be more secure in the first place. Okay. Now, we're living in a new world. As I said, I try not to use AI and ML when I talk, because they got AI. Now, one of the big problems that we're hearing about in the media, and I'm being asked to quote about in the media, is AI and how ChatGPT is going to come for all of you suckers. Now, in reality, AI is just going to make things quicker for attackers. Like automation is just, they're just going to be able to automate things and push very good emails out to people that people click quicker. But the underlying flaws that they're targeting won't change. This has always been a race between good and evil when it comes to security. Like, they get a weapon, we get a weapon. We get a weapon, they get a weapon. Now, in reality, AI is not going to cause the end of the world from a cybersecurity perspective. We'll probably do it for other reasons. Don't quote me as the world's burning down. It's like, but Gavin Millard said it would be okay. It could go wrong, but from a cybersecurity perspective, AI is not going to kill you. Okay, so like AI, I say, like they'll put together like really cool phishing emails. Like, because it's ChatGPT, it'll probably be wrong, but sound very confident about it. But they'll send you those emails, and people will still click. It will still use the same vulnerability. Now, some of the things that really concern me, though, on AI is actually leveraging AI to look at the output of applications and find things that are most probably flaws that can be leveraged in the future. So one of the things that we might see are attackers leveraging AI to automatically look at logs and figure out like new vulnerabilities. In reality, though, we're doing the same thing. Like Tenable actually released a few tools, a few AI tools a few weeks ago that lets you do the same thing. Get your applications, look at the output code, look for things that are indicators of a vulnerability. Okay? So we're both taking the same step. In reality, this lyric is because they got AI, because they got AI, because they got AI, right? Because they got AI, we got AI. We're both taking that step together. Attackers will get quicker access to new vulnerabilities. We'll disclose vulnerabilities quicker as well. Okay. So to be able to fix all of these things, you need to understand where all these exposures are across your entire attack surface. Right? You need to understand the cloud. As I said, infrastructure as code. Focus on those misconfigurations, the vulnerable containers that are being pushed out into your infrastructure. You need to understand the endpoints and where they're vulnerable. Is this running a vulnerable browser, vulnerable email client that's going to be leveraged in a phishing attack? You need to look at operational technology. If you have operational technology in your infrastructure, you are incredibly vulnerable. Full stop. I used to pen test, as I said. I once did a pen test in a power station. As I drove away from the power station, I was pleased I didn't live nearby. It was that vulnerable. OT, you cannot patch OT. Like the place that I did it, I can't tell you where, but the place that I did it, they said, I said, this is so freaking bad, you need to fix it now. And he said, we'll have to do it in 18 months when we bring the other part up and we can then spin this down, okay? So operational technology, you need to understand the intersection between IT and OT and fix those issues before they are leveraged like Colonial. Active Directory, understand that shit. If you don't, it's going to be leveraged against you. No doubt. Attackers want privilege, that's how they get it. And then the other stuff, external attack surface and web apps. Web apps are quite often used as the initial point as well. So, as my closing statement, dead on time, I'd like to point out. One last lyric. Now, if you're similar age to me, this song was played way too much. Just don't go chasing 0 days. Please patch the known bugs and flaws we're used to. Don't waste time patching stuff that isn't going to hurt you. Patch the small amount of vulnerabilities that we know are going to be used against you. The 2.7% of vulnerabilities rather than the 57%. And if you want to know how we do that, we're at the back of the room. Thank you very much.